So we're going to take just maybe 2 questions, maybe 3. There are microphones. You can make your way down. If you have a comment or a question, do that. While you're getting there, I'll start this group with a question that Al has already answered, so I'll let the other 2 answer it. Why do you think the WASP elites ever adopted the philosophy of an open society that not only harmed their country but also undermined their very position as leaders of a Christian or a moral society? What would Buckley have said? I think, Al, we've heard from you on that. Lee?
I'm sorry, would you repeat the question?
Why do you think the WASP elites adopted the philosophy of the open society, which undermined and really harmed their country and their very position as leaders?
Well, I think that, first of all, Bill would say, difficult for me to speak for the WASPs. Begin with that. And number 2, I think probably he would say that sometimes you need a closed society or a semi-closed society and not an open society.
Mm-hmm. You know, I would think there's great difficulty in defining open society. Does it mean building barriers around the WASP culture or not, a closed society? I think that open society basically is very much in the American tradition. From the beginning of migration, immigration, down to the present, it's a little bit uneasy at the moment, but I'm not surprised. WASP would agree with it.
Anyone for the mics? They're open and available. Go ahead.
Thank you. This question, I have some semi-related questions, mostly for Mr. Edwards. So, on the subject of irritable mental gestures, I'm going to do my best not to make an Occupy Wall Street joke, but it seems to me like the 2 positions of conservatives having irritable mental gestures that seem to resemble ideas and liberals having systematic philosophy, these positions seem to have reversed somewhere along the past 40, 50 years. Why? And secondly, I noticed when you listed off the laundry list of adjectives that described Bill's book, you said that elitist was one of them. And these days, of course, you know, nobody would ever claim to be an elitist on the right, to the point that even Bill himself got called one of the great populist saviors by Richard Viguerie. How did this happen?
Well, I think that with regard to the question of elitism, Bill set out in the prospectus for National Review to say that the intent and purpose of National Review was to influence the elites of America, both on the right and also particularly on the left. He was trying to convince them and provide an alternative to the New Republic. So he was not afraid to call himself an elitist, and I think he always presented himself as that, except with that one marvelous wisecrack of his when he was at Harvard and said in the middle of a debate with James Wechsler that he would rather be governed by the first 2,000 names in the Boston telephone directory than the Harvard faculty. So that was a little tip of the hat, you know, to populism. With regard to the question of why the right seems to be more philosophically grounded today than the left, I think it's very simple. If you ask the left just to name 2 or 3 or 4 books in the liberal canon, they would be at a loss to come up with them. Whereas if you ask any decent thinking conservative, a student, including those who are here at Yale, to rattle off 2 or 3 titles, they would say The Road to Serfdom by Hayek. They would say Ideas Have Consequences by Richard Weaver. They would say Witness by Whittaker Chambers. And they would say The Conservative Mind by Russell Kirk. I mean, it's almost something that they not only say, but actually have read those books. But if you ask a liberal the same question, he'll be hard-pressed to come up with an answer beyond Noam Chomsky's latest, diatribe.
We talked about National Review and obviously got him at Yale. In the living room I grew up in, working class, Lower East Side of Manhattan, my parents knew Buckley through Firing Line. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if they were regular viewers. I'm wondering if they were alone in that, what role that wonderful debate format played in helping people understand the competing ideas of the time. Just what role did Firing Line play in all this?
Well, I think Firing Line had a wonderful impact, and I was thinking of it in terms of the address that Buckley was not able to give in his senior year. He basically was bounced from it. I mean, he offered to withdraw, and they took his offer up. I mean, he was blocked from it, and it raised a question not of academic freedom, but free speech. And here was a case where his freedom of speech was being denied. And he doesn't talk about free speech in this book, but he probably does elsewhere. And he certainly exemplified it in Firing Line, with inviting people who disagreed with him completely. And you would have a very vigorous exchange. I think it was a terrific thing for American political culture.
Very briefly, this also wasn't an era where we didn't have audience self-segmentation, where conservatives watch Fox for reaffirmation of what they think, and liberals watch MSNBC or God knows almost anything else on but Fox to reassert what they think. Where if you wanted to hear what George McGovern was thinking about Vietnam, you had to hear Bill Buckley for half the show. And conservatives and liberals going to the same place. We have sadly lost that.
Here you go. I'll help you. Go ahead. State your question. I'll repeat it.
There's an old statement that has been made as long as I can remember that said, if you're not liberal when you're 21, you have no heart. And if you're not a conservative, by the time you're 40, you have no brain. I would love to know if Bill ever answered that in anything that he's written.
You see, some of the answer in God and Man at Yale, he never, not never, rarely uses the word conservative. In those days, he calls himself a radical. He calls himself a radical. Now, in his era, we were discussing this with Linda Bridges yesterday about, what is a conservative? I mean, he loved Russell Kirk, but he would not have said, I'm a Burkean conservative. I accept tradition. I don't want the New Deal tradition. I want to uproot it. That's very, very radical. So and the other line he had was, the older he got, the more he loved young people. His last public address was on this campus. And young people would invigorate him. They gave the movement the energy. And then he said, in a tribute to YAF, an organization Lee Edwards helped begin, Young Americans for Freedom, he said, they're saving us from the values of the National Association of Manufacturers. Right. They understand there is more to life than the profit motive. We're judged by what we give away, what impact we make, not by how much cash we carry. So he never thought of himself as a conservative in that sense. He was definitely conservative for reasons I said earlier about being right with the founders and eternal truths. But
He never addressed that statement.
well, that statement was a statement by Winston Churchill, who changed parties several times, and Bill was on the right and stayed there. Best I could do. He never addressed your quote. No.
So you gave us your answer to why Buckley's critics were so savage. So I'd like to hear Lee and George answer that question, because I remind you, and we all know these quotes, they're pretty horrendous. Ashburn said, under the guise of liberty, he attacks freedom. Under the guise of knowledge, he denies the privilege of free investigation. Under the guise of defending capitalism and religion, he uses the technique of Dr. Goebbels. Under the guise of academic freedom, he hides under the sober robes of theocracy. These weren't gentle words. Why were they so savage?
I knew them both quite well, and I don't know the answer to that. I'm just going to throw in something that's not directly connected, but maybe Ashburn was trying to recover from an embarrassment when he was editor of the Yale News, and the admission of women was under discussion, and he said in an editorial, Yale must be kept homosexual. And everybody who knows him throws that, or used to throw that at his face.
Lee, can you top that?
Well, no, I really can't, and I wouldn't try. I wouldn't try. Maybe it was a feeling of being betrayed, that somehow, he had been a good Yale student, he had been a leader, all these things you talked about, Skull and Bones, chairman of the Daily News and so forth. And that how could this young man do this to us? They just had a sense of betrayal there.
I think that's right.
And then maybe they reacted like that. Is there also perhaps a little bit of, now, sort of, they're there, we're running things, and how can you possibly challenge our reign, our authority, our position? And so I think they were probably
But
reacting.
it was vicious.
And
Both
overreaction,
combinations,
yeah.
both of them, yeah.
Well, it was, but certainly beyond anything that, maybe we might even, would almost remind you of some of the Republican debates we're having right now.
I will say this is the first time I have come across the mainstream, let alone the left, calling conservatives fascists. If you continue to read about Ashburn, he likens this book to the Klan. He talks about we're going to have hooded people not showing their faces if we get the kind of Yale he wants. And he having somebody who fought fascism, I mean, he internalized this, and really want to get Bill Buckley to explode, as Gore Vidal did. And it was, what did he call him? Well, so there you go. And I think he did not expect that.
Well, our time is running out, it's run out, I guess. I'm getting a signal here. So the first panel is over, but we're off to a great start.
Thank you.